There is a species of ant where the queen survives by chewing holes in her own children and drinking their blood. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. She approaches the larva, strokes it gently with her antennae, bites through the skin at the soft crease between its body segments, and drains the fluid from the wound while the larva heals around the injury and waits for the next feeding. A single larva gets bitten dozens of times. It survives every one. Its back becomes a grid of permanent dark scars, the record of every meal its mother took from its body. And the larva that survives that eventually becomes the adult that does the same thing to the next generation. You would expect this to be a behavior that kills colonies, a pathology, a malfunction, an evolutionary mistake. It is not. It is the only reason the colony is still alive at all, because this ant has a structural flaw so fundamental that it cannot swallow solid food. The waist is too narrow, the storage organ doesn't exist. Without a biological loophole to bypass its own anatomy, the entire colony would starve inside 48 hours. The blood drinking is not the horror. The horror is that without it, nothing survives. And this system, the larva as living blood banks, the queen drinking to fuel the next generation, the scars, the punctures, the survival, has been running continuously, underground, without interruption, since before the first flower bloomed on Earth, 107 million years. The question isn't why this ant drinks blood. The question is why every other ant stopped. The ant is called a Dracula ant. Not one species, a whole ancient lineage. The subfamily Amblyopanae. They arose in the mid-Cretaceous period, 107 million years ago, when the Atlantic Ocean was a narrow channel between drifting continents, and flowering plants had not yet colonized the land. No grass, no flowers, just ferns, cycads, and conifers. And somewhere beneath them, in the black soil, these ants were already running the same system they run today. They predate the Tyrannosaurus. They predate the first bird of the modern lineage. They predate the Rocky Mountains by 27 million years. They were ancient before ancient meant anything. They live underground. Strictly, completely, permanently underground, in the oxygen-thin layers of deep soil and rotting heartwood where there is no light and never has been. Most workers are entirely blind. Not poor vision, not reduced sensitivity, no functional eyes at all. Every hunt, every migration, every act of violence and survival happens in total, permanent darkness. Hold your hand flat. A Dracula ant worker would be smaller than the gap between the ridges of your fingerprint. Some species top out at 1.2 millimeters, the size of a grain of sand. A mature colony may contain as few as 50 individuals, not 50,000, not 50 million. 50, the size of a classroom. That gap, between what this animal looks like and what this animal is the whole story. Here is what most people assume about how an ant colony feeds itself. Workers hunt. Workers chew. Workers carry liquid food in a specialized second stomach, a chamber called the social stomach or crop, sitting between the mouth and the digestive tract, designed specifically for storage and transport. The forager returns to the nest. She opens her mouth and donates the stored liquid to the queen, the larvae, the other workers. Mouth to mouth, a living distribution network. The whole system runs cleanly, efficiently, across millions of species, refined over 160 million years. That assumption is correct for the vast majority of ants on Earth. Dracula ants have no social stomach. The crop does not exist. And the waist, the narrow segment connecting thorax to abdomen, is so severely constricted in adult Dracula ants that solid food cannot pass through their digestive tract at all. It is not that they choose not to swallow solid prey. Their own architecture prevents it. The geometry is wrong. It has been wrong for 107 million years. This creates a problem that should be fatal. These ants are predators. Strict, specialized, underground predators. They hunt geophyllomorph centipedes, elongated, armored, venomous soil predators that can measure up to 5 times the ant's own body length. Picture a completely blindfolded human wrestling a 30-foot armored anaconda in a pitch-black tunnel, armed only with 2 hunting knives, with no backup and no way out. That is the prey-to-predator ratio. That is the fight these ants pick. In the dark, every day, with no eyes. They hunt. They paralyze. They drag the centipede into the brood chamber, and then they cannot eat it. An apex predator, anatomically incapable of consuming its own prey. So here is what evolution built to solve that problem. The adults cannot digest the centipede. The larva can. A Dracula ant larva is not a passive, helpless grub waiting to be fed. It is the colony's external digestive system. Evolution gave it specific anatomical tools for this exact role. Its skull is unusually narrow relative to the body, shaped specifically to be driven headfirst into soft tissue. Its mandibular teeth point outward, not inward, designed to tear into flesh. On the underside of its thorax, it carries a fleshy hook. Adult workers grip that hook to carry the larvae through the dirt during colony migrations, the way you would carry a child by the collar. When the paralyzed centipede arrives in the brood chamber, the workers pick up the larvae by those neck hooks and press their tiny heads directly against the soft joints between the centipede's armor plates. The larvae pierce the membrane, bury their heads inside, secrete digestive enzymes that liquefy the centipede's organs from the inside out. Dozens of larvae cluster around a single carcass, submerged headfirst in the meat, converting solid animal tissue into something that flows. Into hemolymph, insect blood, nutrient-dense, liquid, something the adults can drink. The colony waits for the larvae to finish. Then the queen comes. She approaches the larvae slowly, strokes each one with her antennae, a behavior that looks, to every anatomical measure, like grooming, like tenderness. Then she uses her mandibles to pinch the larva's skin at the intersegmental groove, the soft fold between body segments, and bites down until the cuticle tears open. Clear hemolymph beads at the surface. She locks her lower mouthparts to the wound. Her pharyngeal pump pulses visibly. She drains that larva for several minutes, then moves to the next. The larva does not die. The wound coagulates. Dark melanized scar tissue forms over the bite, raised, necrotic, permanent. And when the queen is hungry again, she bites the same larva in a new spot. A single larva may be punctured and drained dozens of times before it pupates. Under a microscope, the dorsal surface of a mature Dracula ant larva does not look like insect skin. It looks like a topographic map of wounds, a grid of dark, raised scabs covering the entire back of a creature that is, biologically, structurally, an infant. Kept alive, kept healing, kept ready for the next feeding. And here is the part that should not be possible, but is. These larvae survive every one of those feedings. They heal, they spin a silken cocoon using particles of soil for structure. They pupate. They eclose as adult workers who will, eventually, do the same thing to the next generation. The larva that survived the queen's teeth becomes the worker that hunts the centipede that feeds the larvae that the queen will drink from. The loop does not close. The loop continues. Here is where you expect evolution to have stopped. The system works. The larvae process solid food. The adults drink liquid blood. The colony persists. Horrifying, yes. Functional, yes. Stable, yes. Done. Evolution did not stop. In a subterranean colony in Japan, researchers studying Leptonilla japonica found something that shifted the expected timeline of this behavior's development entirely. The larvae had not simply tolerated the biting, they had adapted to it, evolved around it, built their own bodies to accommodate it. On the fourth abdominal segment of the Leptonilla larva, there is a small, specialized duct organ, a biological spigot, a hemolymph tap, a structure that exists for exactly one purpose, so the queen can attach her mouthparts and drink, without biting, without tearing, without the violent rupture that leaves scars. The queen simply finds the tap, attaches, and drinks. The children evolved a faucet specifically for their mother. In the genus Proceratium, the optimization went in a different direction. The larvae there developed 4 pairs of cuticular cracks along the dorsal surface. Shallow, pre-scored perforations in the skin, like dotted lines on a package, designed to open cleanly under the queen's mandibles and seal rapidly after feeding. Not a chaotic wound, a structured, repeatable access point. The larvae did not evolve to resist the feeding. They evolved to make the feeding easier. Not because they chose to. Their biology did not offer them a choice. Over millions of years, larvae whose bodies made feeding faster and more efficient produced more surviving siblings, and those traits propagated forward. The efficiency of the sacrifice is encoded in their genetics, built in before they hatch, waiting for the queen to use it. And after the queen drains enough blood, something happens to her body that reveals the full mechanical elegance of the system. Her abdomen swells. Visibly, rapidly, her abdominal segments telescope outward, transforming her from a gaunt, sluggish, starved animal into a bloated, distended egg-laying engine in the span of minutes. The hemolymph she drained converted directly into reproductive fuel, and with that fuel, she lays the next generation. Not a few eggs, a burst, 100 eggs at once, sometimes 200, all synchronized, all the same developmental stage, all destined to become the next batch of living blood stores. The blood she drained from the current larvae becomes the next generation of larvae. One generation consumed to create the next. Now back to the jaw. Because the blood drinking is not the only thing this ant does that shouldn't be possible. These ants hunt centipedes that weigh more than they do. In total darkness, with no eyes. They need to stop that prey instantly, completely, before it can respond. A venomous sting helps, but the sting requires contact, and contact requires getting close, and a centipede that sees you coming can kill you before you close the distance. The Dracula ant solved this with a weapon that operates faster than the prey's nervous system can register the attack. Its jaw snaps shut at 90 meters per second, 200 miles per hour. The entire strike completes in 23 microseconds, 1/5000th of the time it takes your eye to blink. When researchers put Mystrium camillae under a high-speed camera running at 480,000 frames per second, 16,000 times slower than your eye perceives reality, what they saw had no precedent in the scientific literature. The jaw did not open and slam shut. It did not work like scissors or a trap or a hinge. It worked like a finger snap. The ant presses the tips of its mandibles together so hard that the rigid shell of its own face physically bends and deforms inward under the pressure. The ant is loading its own skull with elastic potential energy, the same way you load a spring by compressing it. Then the friction latch between the two mandibles slips, and all that stored energy releases at once. The jaw does not close, it snaps past itself. One mandible crosses the other like two fingers snapping, driving an explosive shockwave outward at 100,000 Gs of acceleration. For comparison, a fighter pilot loses consciousness at 9 Gs. A fatal car crash generates roughly 100 Gs. The Dracula ant's jaw operates at 100,000 Gs, 1,000 times the force of the crash that would end a human life. And the ant's head does not rupture. It fires again within seconds. Not because the ant is strong, not because the muscles are exceptional, because the jaw bypassed muscles entirely. This is latch-mediated spring actuation, elastic energy stored in the exoskeleton itself, released through a mechanical latch. The ant turned its own face into a loaded weapon. And that weapon has a second use that nobody predicted. If a predator breaches the nest, a Mystrium worker points its head at the ground, fires the snapjaw at the dirt, and uses the 100,000 G recoil to catapult itself backward through the air, 10 centimeters in a single explosive bounce, tumbling safely into a lower tunnel before the predator can track it. The fastest jaw on Earth doubles as an ejector seat. None of this works without centipedes. The centipedes do not cooperate. When Opamerma hungvuong workers encounter mecystocephalous centipedes underground, they locate the prey's antennae first, the centipede's primary sensory apparatus, and clamp down on them, physically removing the centipede's ability to perceive its surroundings before it can react. Then, while the prey is disoriented, they curl their gasters under their bodies and drive a venomous stinger directly into the soft tissue of the centipede's throat. Not the armored back, the throat, the one place the armor does not cover. Targeted, sequential, completely sightless. But one misjudged strike and the dynamic reverses entirely. Scolioplane centipedes evolved a counterweapon specifically engineered against amblyopenine ants. When bitten, they rupture their own armor deliberately and bleed a thick, highly viscous hemolymph. Not blood in any nutritive sense, toxic glue. It floods over the ant's mandibles, legs, and feet on contact. The ant cannot groom it free, cannot pull its own legs apart. The toxin causes rapid muscular failure as the ant writhes and suffocates. The ant dies within 24 hours. Immobilized, asphyxiated, entombed in the defensive fluid of the prey it tried to kill. The centipede slithers away unhurt. The ant dies in the dark, alone, encased in biological amber that was never meant to preserve anything. This is not an edge case. This is a documented arms race that has been running for tens of millions of years. The ants developed venom sophisticated enough to paralyze prey 10 times their size. The centipedes developed a counter-defense that kills ants on contact. The ants refined their attack sequences to target unarmored tissue. The centipedes deepened the toxicity of the fluid. Back and forth, in the dark, for longer than mammals have existed. And the stakes of this arms race are absolute. There is no fallback prey. Researchers have placed starving Dracula ant colonies in front of sugar water, honey, alternative insects, fruit. The ants refuse. All of it. They will starve to death before they eat anything that is not a centipede. Not out of stubbornness. Their digestive biology has narrowed so completely around one prey type that their bodies cannot process alternatives. They are the apex predators of the underground, locked in mortal dependence on the one creature capable of killing them. Specialization is always a bet. And in biology, the house does not always lose. The Dracula ant lineage did not stop at one predatory strategy. Over 107 million years, isolated populations in different environments found different targets, and the results are just as extreme. The subterranean ant Sissia humicola does not hunt centipedes, it hunts ants. Blind, operating by chemical trace alone, Sissia workers infiltrate the nurseries of neighboring colonies, species like Phytole and Tetramorium, and raid their brood chambers. They steal larvae and pupae. They carry the stolen brood back to their own nest, where their own larvae process the stolen flesh exactly as they would process centipede flesh. This is not territorial raiding. Sissia is an obligate brood predator. It eats nothing else. If the neighboring colonies collapse or relocate, Sissia starves. A predator of predators, blind, underground, stealing children to feed to its own children. Then there is Proceradium. While most Dracula ant genera hunt living arthropod prey, Proceradium diverged entirely. It hunts eggs, specifically spider eggs. Proceradium workers raid subterranean spider nests, locate egg masses, and carry them back to their own brood chambers. Not to be eaten immediately, but to be hoarded, stockpiled. The way harvester ants hoard seeds for the dry season. This required a physical solution. Spider eggs are spherical, smooth, and nearly impossible to grip with standard ant mandibles. Over millions of years, Proceradium's abdomen evolved to point radically forward, rotating and recurving toward the ant's own head, creating a carrying geometry that allows the ant to tuck a perfect, slippery sphere against its body, without dropping it during the long journey through the dark. Its own body became a cradle for the eggs of another predator. In Leptonilla, in Amblyopone, in Sissia, in Proceradium, 4 entirely different solutions to the same core problem. 4 lineages of the same ancient family, sealed underground, unable to communicate across geological time, each arriving at a different form of extreme biological invention. Evolution does not have a plan, it has pressure, and in 107 million years, pressure produces things that look like genius and function like nightmares. Here is what makes the Dracula ant something more than a catalog of extreme biology. The specialization does not end with diet. Most ant colonies reproduce through flight. A virgin queen hatches with wings. She joins a mating swarm hundreds of meters in the air, mates with males from foreign colonies, lands in new territory, sheds her wings, and begins a colony from scratch. This aerial dispersal is how ant genes spread across continents. It is how ants conquered every landmass on Earth except Antarctica. Many Dracula ant species have no flying queens. Not fewer flying queens. None. The genus Adetomyrma, the Dracula ants of Madagascar, has been surveyed across decades of fieldwork, multiple colonies, multiple field seasons. Researchers have never once found a winged queen. The reproductive females are permanently wingless workers, with activated ovaries, who fight each other for dominance inside the colony. The winners lay eggs. The losers return to hunting. The colony cannot spread by flight. It spreads by walking. A reproductive female separates from the parent colony, walks a short distance, meters, perhaps tens of meters, accompanied by a cohort of workers, and begins a new nest. The gene pool of the new colony is the gene pool of the old colony, minus the distance of a short walk. Over generations, those gene pools narrow. They fold back on themselves. In ants, in all Hymenoptera, sex is determined by a system called complementary sex determination. Males come from unfertilized eggs. Females come from fertilized eggs. When a queen mates with a genetically distinct male, the fertilized eggs develop normally into female workers. When a queen mates with a male whose sex determination allele matches her own, which is what happens in an inbred colony, increasingly often, the fertilized eggs do not produce female workers. They produce diploid males. Males with 2 full sets of chromosomes. Sterile, non-functional, unable to work, unable to defend the nest, unable to hunt, unable to reproduce. They are born with wings, with highly developed sensory organs, with the biological equipment for a life they will never participate in. They are born. They consume the colony's larval hemolymph. They do nothing. They die. In a colony, where every drop of blood the larvae produce is the margin between survival and collapse, sterile males are not a nuisance. They are a death sentence that unfolds over generations. The proportion of sterile males rises with each inbreeding cycle. The hunting force shrinks. The larvae are drained faster to support adults who produce nothing. The colony does not collapse suddenly. It collapses over generations, thinning, narrowing, running slower, until the last workers are hunting centipedes with mandibles too few and bodies too old, for a queen who lays eggs that will never become workers. Not from disease, not from drought, not from predation. From the mathematics of a closed gene pool. Adetomyrma venatrix, the Dracula ant of Madagascar, with colonies reaching up to 10,000 individuals, large by any standard for this lineage, is currently listed as critically endangered by the IUCN. Its entire documented range is a shrinking fragment of the Zambezi forest in southwestern Madagascar. That forest is being cleared for agriculture, logged for charcoal production, burned at the edge. The boundary between forest and cleared land advances every year, and the forest does not grow back on agricultural timescales. These ants cannot relocate. They cannot fly. They cannot cross deforested ground. The heat, the dryness, the compacted soil, the absence of the specific subsurface moisture profile their bodies require, any one of these kills them. During dry seasons, an entire colony migrates vertically downward 30 centimeters into the earth, carrying its scarred larvae, chasing the one environmental condition their biology demands. That moisture line exists beneath forest canopy. It does not exist on open farmland. When the forest goes, the ants go under it. 107 million years of continuous biological refinement. The world record for the fastest movement in animal history. The only lineage to evolve a jaw powered by spring actuation in the exoskeleton of its own head. The only ants to evolve biological blood taps on their own offspring. The only ant lineage that predates the flowering plants that now cover most of the Earth's land surface. Being buried alive in a forest that is burning faster than they can walk. There is no villain in this story. There is a forest being converted by people who need to eat, and an ant that cannot move fast enough to leave, and a gap between those two facts measured in decades and filled with irreversible loss. 107 million years, ended by 50 years of deforestation. Here is the mathematics of a single Dracula ant larva's existence. It hatches. The colony is synchronized. All larvae hatch at the same stage, develop in lockstep, mature together. This is not coincidence. A nomadic, highly specialized colony cannot afford staggered development. The brood must be ready in bulk for the blood harvest to be efficient. All of them, the same size, at the same time, together. The larva feeds on centipede tissue for days. It grows. It converts solid animal protein into liquid nutrient. Its dorsal surface begins to accumulate the evidence of this arrangement. Dark scabs appearing wherever the queen's mandibles have opened the skin, coagulating, healing, hardening into permanent raised scar tissue. At peak development, a single larva may carry a dozen distinct scars, melanized, permanent, spaced across the back in a pattern that maps every feeding event in chronological order. Then it pupates. It heals. It ecloses as an adult worker, eyeless, armored, functional. For the first weeks of its adult life, it remains in the brood chamber nursing the next generation. Then it moves to foraging. Then, older still, it ventures into the deep tunnels on hunting runs, tracking chemical footprint trails left by its sisters, pursuing centipedes through passages it has never entered, in darkness that is total and permanent and has never once been broken. The larva that survived the queen's teeth becomes the worker that hunts the centipede, that feeds the larvae that the queen will drink from. Every individual in the colony passes through both roles, kept alive and keeping others alive, drained and draining, prey and predator. And the entire system runs without a plan, without a leader, without a single ant that understands what it is part of. The queen does not direct the colony. The colony is the direction. The Dracula ant jaw is not only a record. It is a proof of concept. Latch-mediated spring actuation, loading elastic energy into a rigid structure and releasing it through a mechanical latch, is now a formal discipline in biomechanical engineering. Roboticists at Harvard's Wyss Institute and at Georgia Tech have published work specifically on this mechanism as a template for microscale actuators, robotic grippers that move faster than electric motors allow, jump launch platforms for insect-scale machines, surgical micro-tools that need to operate at speeds no conventional motor can achieve. The ant's face is a blueprint for machines that do not yet exist at human scale. And the colony's feeding loop, hunting, external digestion, hemolymph transfer, physogastry, synchronized egg-laying, synchronized hatching, repeat, is one of the most complete examples of a biological closed-loop system ever described. No individual understands it, no individual oversees it. The loop persists because every ant that broke it left no descendants, and every ant that completed it left a colony behind. 107 million iterations of pruning. until what remains cannot fail. The Dracula ant does not know it is extraordinary. It hunts in the dark. It feeds its larvae to a centipede. It drinks the blood that comes back. It heals the wounds it made. It lays the next generation in a burst of 200 eggs and waits for them to grow large enough to need. It does all of this because its ancestors, who did not do this, left nothing behind. The jaw that breaks every record, the faucet the children grew for their mother, the mother who drinks, the sterile sons, born from a closed gene pool, draining the colony toward extinction, one generation at a time. The forest disappearing above a colony of 50 pale, blind, ancient animals that cannot walk fast enough to escape it. The entire system, intact, unchanged, running beneath every continent on Earth since before the ground looked like this. You will never see one, but somewhere under your feet right now, there is an ant pressing the tips of its mandibles together in absolute darkness, bending its own skull into a spring, waiting for something to get close enough to be worth the strike. And it has been waiting, in one form or another, for longer than the Rocky Mountains have existed.